For 10,000 years, the Zifran Dominion had ruled the stars, their influence stretching across hundreds of systems. They were a civilization of elegance and precision, a species that prided itself on technological supremacy and strategic brilliance. Their fleets were a marvel of engineering, sleek, efficient, and utterly dominant. Their bureaucratic machine ensured total control over their vassal species. Their economy was an unshakable force, fueled by centuries of expansion and exploitation. To the Zifrans, they were eternal. But belief meant nothing in the face of annihilation. The Ketal supremacy had come like a shadow cast over the stars. Their warships were jagged constructs of violence, bristling with brutal weaponry designed for one thing: obliteration. They did not demand surrender. They did not engage in diplomacy. They simply advanced, like a devouring plague, burning entire planets to ash. No one had been prepared. No one had stopped them. And now, the Zifrans were losing everything. Across the Zifran Dominion, distress beacons screamed into the void. Their messages carried a single desperate plea. To any who can hear this, we beg for aid. The Ketal are unstoppable. They are annihilating our worlds. If you have the power to stand against them, help us, please. The transmission spread across every known communication frequency, bouncing from system to system. Silence answered. The Zifrans had always been proud, arrogant, even. Their rule had been absolute, their control unquestioned. They had stood at the pinnacle of civilization, looking down upon the lesser species of the galaxy as subjects, pawns, or nuisances. Now, those species watched as the Zifrans begged for salvation. And they turned away. No one forgot how the Zifrans had once enforced their will, how they had crushed rebellions with cold efficiency, how they had manipulated economies, shattered fleets, and dictated the fates of entire species. The Ketal knew this. It was why they had attacked. No allies, no reinforcements, no future. One by one, Zifran worlds fell. Their once great war fleets, designed for strategic superiority, were utterly unprepared for the sheer brutality of the Ketal. Their commanders, trained for precision warfare, found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy that fought like a rabid beast, unstoppable, relentless, merciless. It was only a matter of time before the Dominion ceased to exist. Then something changed. One of the distress calls was answered. In the war-torn chambers of the Zifran High Council, deep within the fortress world of Velaris Prime, silence reigned. Golden light flickered from the great holo-displays, casting eerie shadows across the assembled rulers. Their faces, once filled with the unshakable confidence of a species that had never known true defeat, were now lined with fear, exhaustion, and despair. High Chancellor Irenix stood at the center, his silver-trimmed robes hanging loosely on his once proud frame. His voice, once the commanding force of the Zifran Dominion, now trembled as he read the words displayed before him. A simple response, a name that had not been spoken in centuries, a name that sent an unnatural stillness through the chamber. Request acknowledged. Stand by. The room froze. The assembled counselors, admirals, and strategists all stared at the glowing message as if it were a ghost. Humanity. The name alone carried weight. Fear, mystery, power. No one truly knew what had happened to them. Long ago, humanity had been cast from the galactic stage. The records were vague, the details obscured in layers of bureaucratic secrecy. Some said they had been exiled. Others claimed they had been destroyed. Yet there had always been whispers. The last war they had fought, the final stand that had sealed their fate, had been so brutal, so horrific, that the Zifrans and their allies had erased the details from history itself. The few that knew the truth had long since faded from power. And now, they had returned. But why? Had they answered the distress call out of some lingering sense of duty, a desire for vengeance? Or had they simply been waiting for the right moment to reemerge? No one in the chamber spoke, because in that moment, one unshakable truth settled over them like a shroud. Humanity had not been destroyed. They had simply been gone, waiting, preparing. And now something had awakened them. On the front lines of the invasion, the Ketal warlord Admiral Korak watched as the remnants of Zifran resistance collapsed before his forces. The battle was already won. His fleet, a vast and unstoppable machine of destruction, carved through the last remaining Zifran defense lines. Their capital ships burned in orbit. Their last war fleets lay in ruins. Their final fortress world, Velaris Prime, was within his grasp. Korak stood upon the bridge of his dreadnought, Bloodspire, staring at the holographic display of the unfolding slaughter. He had grown bored of this conquest. The Zifrans were nothing. Their technology, once impressive, meant nothing before the sheer brutality of the Ketal. Their fleets, designed for precise engagements, had been shattered by sheer overwhelming force. Victory was inevitable. And then, something appeared on his sensors. A fleet. Small. Too small to be a threat. Barely a dozen warships. Dark and angular against the void. Human ships. Korak sneered. Pathetic, he muttered. They come to die alongside their Zifran masters. His officers laughed. Another desperate fool rushing to their doom. They had no idea what was about to be unleashed. For centuries, the galaxy had forgotten about humanity. But humanity had not forgotten the galaxy. They had been waiting. And now, they had returned. The Ketal were about to learn the truth. Humanity was not lost. They were simply the most feared force the universe had ever known. The Zifran High Council watched in eerie silence as the unknown fleet moved through the void. Their ships were unlike anything seen in thousands of years. Black, angular behemoths that seemed to drink in the light. No insignias, no markings, just shadows in the abyss. High Chancellor Erinix stood at the center of the chamber, his violet eyes locked onto the holographic projection before him. The lead vessel was enormous, larger than any Zifran dreadnought, yet it moved with unsettling grace. Not a single transmission came from the fleet, no battle songs, no declarations of war, not even a standard identification code. Only the single chilling message from before. Request acknowledged. Stand by. Erinix's voice was barely a whisper. Impossible. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. The humans should not exist. Their entire species had been wiped from the galactic stage, lost to history. The Dominion had ensured it. They had ensured that the horrors of the last war, the war that ended in humanity's disappearance, would never be repeated. Yet now, they were here. "Is this a trick?" murmured a counselor. A desperate ploy from some scavenger fleet. But the Zifran Admiral Xion, a veteran of countless battles, shook his head. His golden war armor gleamed under the chamber's dim lighting as he studied the display. "No," he said grimly. "That is not a scavenger fleet." Erinix turned to him sharply. "How can you be sure?" Xion exhaled, his fingers tightening into a fist. "Because no one else in the galaxy builds ships like that." The silence deepened. Everyone knew the stories. Old rumors, secret reports. The last war humanity fought had been so brutal, so apocalyptic, that the Zifrans had been forced to erase entire records of it. The High Council had hidden the truth, fearing what would happen if any species, even their own, were to remember what humanity had done. And now, the nightmare had returned. At the edge of the battlefield, Admiral Korak of the Ketal Supremacy stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, Bloodspire, a hulking beast of war designed for one thing: absolute devastation. Before him, the last Zifran strongholds were crumbling. It was supposed to be the final victory. Yet now, something else had arrived. His eyes narrowed at the incoming fleet, a mere 12 ships, 12 against the armada of the Ketal, which spanned hundreds of warships. The Ketal were conquerors, bred for war since the dawn of their existence. Their fleets had never known defeat. Their warriors had never bowed. And yet, something about these ships unsettled him. Their design was unnerving. No visible engines, No external weaponry. No thermal signatures. Just dark silhouettes, moving like specters in the void. Magnify, Korak growled. The holo display adjusted, and he felt a flicker of something he did not recognize. It was not fear. The Ketal did not fear. But something felt wrong. What species are they? Demanded his second-in-command. Some Zifran allies. Korak snarled. No, the Zifrans have no allies. No one came for them. No one should have answered their call. Yet, someone had. One of his officers scoffed. Then they are fools. They think 12 ships can stand against us. Korak was about to agree, until the human ships began to move. And the battlefield changed forever. The first strike. The human fleet did not charge. They did not broadcast demands. They simply appeared, moving with eerie precision, almost like ghosts through the dark. The Ketal warships reacted instantly, weapons charging, shields raised. The sheer size of their armada was overwhelming. Any species would have surrendered on sight. But then, the first Ketal warship exploded. Not from a missile, not from an energy blast. It simply ceased to exist. One moment, it was there. The next, a silent burst of light, a ripple in space, and then nothing. Korak's breath hitched. What was that? His officers scrambled for answers, scanning the battlefield, searching for the weapon. There was none. Another explosion. Then another. And another. The Ketal fleet broke into chaos. They were warriors, trained to counter energy-based weapons, projectile strikes, and even biological warfare. But this was something else. The human ships never fired a visible shot. No projectiles, no energy beams. Yet Ketal vessels vanished one by one, as if the very laws of physics had been rewritten around them. Panic surged through the fleet. For the first time in Ketal history, their warriors felt something they had never known before. Powerlessness. The unseen weapon. Admiral Korak roared. Shields to maximum. Analyze their weapons. His officers frantically worked, scanning every frequency, every spectrum. Yet they found nothing. No emissions, no radiation spikes, no energy readings. Nothing. As if the humans were not even attacking. But that was impossible. Korak watched as an entire battle group, 20 Ketal warships, simply disintegrated in the void. Their hulls folded in on themselves, their mass collapsing into tiny singularities before vanishing completely. The horror spread through the fleet like a sickness. The Ketal were used to violence, to pain. But this was something else entirely. It was a force beyond war. Something ancient. Something they did not understand. For the first time, Korak felt it. A cold, gnawing terror. His hands trembled. He turned to his second-in-command, voice low. What are they? The officer's face was pale, his throat dry. He whispered the only answer that made sense. They are the ones who were forgotten. The message spread through the fleet. The humans had returned, and the Ketal had made a fatal mistake. They had not simply awoken an old enemy. They had awoken the most feared force in the universe. And now, they would pay the price. The Ketal fleet was in disarray. The war cries that once filled their communication channels were now replaced with desperate, frantic orders. Retreat, evade, counterattack. None of them worked. Admiral Korak stood frozen, his claws digging into the armrest of his command throne. His warriors were dying, but not in glorious combat. There were no enemy salvos to withstand, no energy beams to deflect. His fleet was being erased from existence, one ship at a time. His mind raced for answers. Every Ketal battle doctrine, every maneuver, every contingency, they all relied on understanding the enemy's weapons. But here, there was nothing to analyze. Korak's second-in-command, a seasoned warrior with 3 lifetimes of combat experience, turned toward him with wide, unblinking eyes. They are using something unnatural, Another ship collapsed into itself, warping space in a way Korak had never seen before. There was no explosion, no wreckage, just a ripple in reality. And then nothing. Korak's rage surged. He would not let his fleet be hunted like prey. He slammed his fist against the control panel. All ships, execute Harrow formation. Focus fire on the nearest enemy vessel. Find their weakness. The Ketal fleet moved into a tight predatory formation, directing the full force of their arsenal at a single human warship. The void ignited with energy. Thousands of high-yield plasma lances, quantum missiles, and antimatter torpedoes converged on the target. A single warship. It did not move. The barrage struck and passed through it. Korak's mind reeled. It was impossible. The weapons didn't miss. The ship was there. He could see it. Yet the moment their fire connected, it was as if the ship had never existed at all. The blasts sailed through empty space, detonating harmlessly in the void. Then the human warship shifted. Not in the way a normal vessel moved. It didn't accelerate or adjust its trajectory. It simply became somewhere else. Korak felt something cold tighten in his gut. A transmission cut through the noise. Not Zifran. Not Ketal. Something far more ancient. A single voice. Flat. Devoid of emotion. You do not understand the battlefield. The Ketal fleet ceased fire. Every warrior felt it. A presence. Something inhuman. Something that should not be. And then the human fleet attacked. The second wave was different. No silent disappearances. No flickering ripples in space. This time, the destruction was deliberate. The lead human warship moved in an instant. One moment, a speck in the distance. The next, towering over Korak's dreadnought. A pulse of black light erupted from its core. Not a weapon. Something far worse. The very fabric of space shuddered. Shields meant nothing. Armor meant nothing. The Ketal ships buckled inward, warping and twisting in ways that defied physics. Screams filled the comms. Horrific, unnatural screams. Not from pain. Not from fire or destruction. From something far deeper. Something was breaking them. Not just their ships. Their minds. Admiral Korak's vision blurred. His own thoughts felt distant. Fragmented. He clutched the armrest, forcing himself to remain standing as his crew collapsed around him. One of his bridge officers clawed at his own face, screaming until his throat gave out. Another froze completely, staring into nothingness, his body unnaturally still. Korak turned, forcing his gaze to the human ship outside. It had no windows, no markings, no indication that anything inside was even alive. He realized, with a creeping horror, that the humans were not fighting them. They were demonstrating something. A lesson. A warning. His second in command, the fiercest warrior he had ever known, collapsed to his knees. His voice was barely a whisper. They are not here to fight. Korak's throat felt dry. His body ached. The weight of something unseen pressed down on him. He looked at the destruction around him. The broken ships, the crumbling minds of his warriors. And for the first time, in all his years of conquest, he understood. This was not war. This was punishment. Korak's mind burned with the echoes of something he could not comprehend. The weight of the unseen force pressed against his skull, a suffocating presence that felt like it had been watching him since the dawn of time. Around him, his bridge crew lay motionless. Some were breathing, barely. Others were trapped in silent convulsions, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide with absolute terror. Korak forced himself to stand. His claws trembled as he clutched the command console. The human warship had not fired a single conventional weapon. Yet his fleet was dying. His second in command had not moved in minutes. His powerful form, once a towering monument of Ketal strength, was now hunched, his hands clasped over his skull, trembling. A deep, guttural voice escaped his lips. Not a word. A prayer. Korak felt his stomach turn. The Ketal did not pray. Not to gods. Not to ancestors. They conquered. They slaughtered. They proved their dominance over the weak. And yet, his second in command, a warrior who had torn through a dozen empires without hesitation, was pleading. A choked whisper. Make it stop. Korak turned his gaze back to the human warship outside his viewport. It was featureless, silent, watching, waiting. For what? His claws curled into the console. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. The Kital had been called here by the Zifran Empire, begged to annihilate the human forces. The Zifran had promised an easy war. They had lied. Korak's lips pulled back in a snarl. He slammed his fist against the console, forcing his voice to rise above the lingering silence. All remaining ships, form up. We are leaving this system. No response. His fleet, once 50 warships strong, had been reduced to a handful of broken, drifting hulks. He switched to private command channels, desperately scanning for survivors. A voice crackled through the static. Faint, shaking. Admiral, we cannot move. Korak's rage faltered. Explain. The officer's voice came in fragments, broken by static. Engines, offline. Power, bleeding. Korak snarled, pivoting to his engineering officer. Status report. Why are we not moving? No response. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. The engineering officer was frozen in place. Not slumped. Not unconscious. Frozen. His eyes were wide, mouth slightly open, hands hovering just inches above his control panel, as if time itself had forgotten him. Korak felt a chill crawl up his spine. Then he noticed something else. The entire bridge crew was frozen. No movement, no breath. Only Korak remained. The silence pressed in, suffocating. His own breath sounded unnaturally loud. And then, a voice. Not over the comms. Not through any transmission. Inside his skull. You do not understand the battlefield. Korak whirled around, his claws raised. But he was alone. No enemy. No shadow. Nothing. Yet the voice remained, wrapping around his thoughts like unseen chains. You were never meant to see this war. Korak clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand tall. Who are you? A long, terrible silence. And then, leave. The pressure in his skull surged, his vision darkened. The last thing he saw before collapsing was the human warship, waiting, watching. Endless. Korak felt himself falling, but he never hit the ground. Instead, he was floating, or perhaps trapped. He couldn't tell. The world around him was an abyss, a formless void without sound, without light, without even the comfort of his own breath. He tried to move, but his body no longer obeyed him. His limbs were weightless, as if they had never existed. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not paralysis, not unconsciousness. Something had separated him from reality itself. A whisper crawled through the darkness. You do not belong here. Korak snarled, forcing his mind to fight against whatever was happening. The Kital were warriors, conquerors. He would not cower in the presence of an enemy he could not see. Show yourself. The abyss did not stir. The voice returned, this time not as a whisper, but as a presence pressing against his mind. You were never meant to be a witness. Korak struggled against the unseen force, but his mind felt as though it were being unmade. Fractured memories surged forward. Battles, victories, the screams of his enemies, but they shattered the moment he tried to hold on to them. His sense of time blurred. He no longer knew if he had been in this void for seconds or centuries. Then, a change, a ripple. The abyss shifted, and Korak saw it. The human warship, not through a viewport, not through sensors. It was inside him, inside his mind. It was vast, monolithic, and it was not a ship. Not in the way he had understood ships before. It was something else, something ancient, something wrong. Korak tried to pull away, but there was no escape. He was bound to this thing, this presence that had snared his mind and crushed his fleet without firing a single shot. And then, the whispers turned into a flood, a million voices. They spoke in a language he did not understand. No, that was not right. He did understand, because they were his own thoughts. They echoed back at him, twisted, altered, shaped into meanings he could not bear to face. We are the force that was never meant to wake. We are the war that should never be fought. You asked for war, and war has answered. Korak's mind reeled. He had faced gods in battle before, mighty alien warlords who claimed dominion over entire quadrants. But this was not a god. This was something worse, something that had been buried, something that had been forgotten. And the Zifran Empire, the fools who had summoned the Ketal here, had made the greatest mistake in galactic history. They had begged for help, and they had woken this. The human warship remained motionless, silent. Yet Korak felt it looking at him, not just at him, through him, seeing every war he had ever fought, every battle he had ever won. And then it spoke, not in words, in truth. The Ketal had thought themselves warriors, but to this force, they were nothing more than blind animals, stumbling toward a slaughter they could not comprehend. Korak felt his sanity slipping. This was not war. This was annihilation of the mind. The human warship had destroyed his fleet without a single shot, and now it was undoing him. He was not dying. No, he was being erased. His name, his identity, his very essence fading. Korak struggled against it. He was a warrior of the Ketal. He would not be forgotten. He roared, forcing his will against the darkness, against the void, against whatever this thing was. And the abyss shattered. Korak collapsed onto cold metal. He was back, on his ship, gasping, trembling, his body slick with sweat, his claws digging into the floor beneath him. The bridge was silent, his crew still frozen. The human warship was still there, unchanged. Yet Korak knew something had happened, something that no other Ketal had ever survived. The voice did not return, but Korak understood its message. He had been given one chance, to run, to flee, to warn others of what the Zifran had unleashed. Because if this force ever truly awakened, there would be no universe left to conquer. Korak's claws scraped against the cold metal floor as he forced himself upright. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The warship still lingered in the void before him, silent, unmoving. Yet Korak knew he had been marked. The bridge crew remained frozen, their eyes vacant, their bodies locked in place, as though time itself had refused to move forward for them. Only he had been spared. Why him? His own thoughts felt foreign, twisted, altered by whatever had reached into his mind. The battle had ended before it had even begun, not through destruction, not through violence, but through something far worse, something ancient, something awake. Korak staggered toward his command chair, his balance unsteady, his vision blurred. Then, a whisper, not from the warship, not from his mind, from the void itself, a voice like cracked stone, distant and hollow, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 battles lost. Do you understand now? Korak froze. The whisper did not belong to his enemy. It belonged to his own kind. He turned his gaze toward the ruined remains of his fleet. Jagged wrecks drifted aimlessly, their once mighty hulls now lifeless husks. The Ketal warships, proud vessels of conquest, were now nothing more than debris. And then he saw it. Or rather, them. Figures, barely visible, like phantoms moving among the wreckage. Ketal warriors, but not living ones. Echoes, faded remnants of something long forgotten. Their voices did not come as screams or wails of pain. They came as warnings. You will leave this place. You will never return. Korak's blood ran cold. The Ketal were not the first. This had happened before. Again, and again, and again. Warriors, conquerors, armadas, all had come. None had left. Yet he was still alive, still breathing, still conscious. The human worship had not erased him, not completely. It had given him a message. And the Ketal did not leave warnings, not unless the cost of silence was far worse. Korak's gaze turned back to the warship. It was waiting. Not for him, not for the Ketal, for the rest of the galaxy, for the moment when someone, anyone, would make the mistake of waking it fully. Korak had to leave. He reached for the command console, his claws shaking as he overrode the bridge's lockdown. A sharp hiss filled the air as his officers stirred from their unnatural paralysis, blinking in confusion. They did not remember. They could not remember. Their minds had been spared whatever had reached into his own. Only Korak had seen. Only Korak knew. The bridge filled with scattered voices as the crew tried to process the wreckage surrounding them. The overwhelming silence of what had once been their mighty fleet. "Commander," one of his officers whispered. "What? What happened?" Korak's throat tightened. He could not tell them the truth. If they knew, if they understood what lurked in the void, it would break them. He turned toward the ship's helm. "Prepare for warp," he ordered. "Now." The crew hesitated. "But Commander, our reinforcements." "There will be no reinforcements." Korak roared, his voice filled with a fury that stunned them into silence. The bridge fell deathly quiet. The crew looked at him in confusion, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. They did not understand. But they obeyed. One by one, the surviving systems of the ship flickered back to life. Navigation controls came online. The warp drive hummed with power. The vessel turned away from the battlefield, its prow angling toward the distant stars. Korak forced himself to look forward. Not at the warship. Not at what had been left behind. He would not speak of this again. Not to his crew. Not to his superiors. Not to the Zifran Empire, the fools who had called the Ketal here in the first place. No one would believe him. And even if they did, it would change nothing. The galaxy was vast. And it was doomed. The Ketal vessel surged forward, space distorting as the warp drive activated. The stars stretched. And then, they were gone. The void remained. Silent. Waiting. The human warship did not move. It did not need to. It had already won. And when the next foolish empire came looking for war, it would be waiting. The void swallowed the Ketal vessel as it vanished into warp, leaving behind a battlefield that no longer belonged to the living. The shattered remains of warships, some still faintly glowing from energy discharges, floated aimlessly, their crews long reduced to dust. And yet, the war was not over. Because the war had never truly begun. The human warship remained, silent, unmoving. But silence did not mean absence. It was watching. It was waiting. And across the cold reaches of the galaxy, the echoes of this encounter would spread, carried not by the victors, because there were none, but by the defeated, by Korak, by the one who had seen and lived, and by the ones who would come after him. The Zifran Empire's War Council gathered in the heart of their capital world, a planet of towering spires and glittering citadels. The chamber was vast, its walls adorned with banners of conquest, reminders of the many civilizations they had crushed under their rule. Yet, for the first time in living memory, they had no victory to celebrate. Only a message. The Ketal warlord stood before them, his massive form dwarfed by the sheer scale of the throne-like seats surrounding him. But Korak was no longer the warrior they had once known. His posture, once unshakable, was tense, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His gaze, once filled with fire, was now cold. He had seen something, and that something had changed him. The Ziffern Emperor leaned forward, his ornate robes shimmering under the council chamber's golden lights. His elongated features twisted into a scowl as he studied the Ketal warlord. "You return without conquest," the Emperor said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Where is our tribute? Where are the spoils of war?" Korak said nothing. The council murmured among themselves, their voices sharp, impatient. They wanted answers. They wanted blood. Finally, the Emperor rose to his feet. His gaze bore into Korak, his patience thinning. "Speak," the Emperor commanded. "What did you find?" Korak took a slow breath. "Then, finally," he answered, "death." The chamber fell silent. The Emperor's expression hardened. "You were defeated." Korak shook his head. "We were not allowed to be defeated. We were erased." A ripple of confusion spread through the council. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Korak clenched his jaw. His claws twitched at his sides, itching to grab the weapon that was not there. He could not explain. Not in a way they would understand. How could he describe what had happened when he barely understood it himself? How could he make them see what was now seared into his soul? The war had not ended in fire. It had not ended in a last, desperate stand. It had ended before it even began. The warship had reached into their minds. It had taken something, and in return, it had left something behind. A warning, a scar, a silence that would never leave him. Korak raised his head, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You sent us to claim a graveyard," he said, "but the dead were not buried. They were waiting." The Emperor scoffed. "You speak in riddles, warlord." Korak stepped forward, his voice low, firm. "Then let me speak plainly. There is something out there, something that does not belong to this galaxy, something that does not obey the laws of war, of strategy, of conquest. We did not fight it. We did not even scratch it. We were nothing to it." The Emperor's expression darkened. "And yet you returned." Korak exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into fists. "I returned because it let me." Another murmur spread through the chamber, but this time it was different. There was something beneath it, something they did not want to acknowledge, something they feared. The Ziffern Empire had built its dominion on absolute superiority, on the belief that no enemy was beyond their power to crush, no fleet beyond their ability to outmatch. And yet, before them stood a warlord, one of the most feared warriors in the known galaxy, speaking not of victory, not of survival, but of something that had simply chosen to ignore them. The Emperor's lips curled in disdain. "You were defeated. That is all I hear." Korak stared at him. Then he did something none in the chamber expected. He laughed. It was a harsh, empty sound, a sound devoid of humor, devoid of life. And when it faded, he looked the Emperor in the eye and said, "Then send another fleet." The words hung in the air, suffocating the room in their weight. The Emperor did not respond, nor did the council, because in that moment they understood. It was not about strength. It was not about firepower. It was about acknowledgement. If they sent another fleet, they would be admitting, to themselves, to the galaxy, to history, that something had happened. Something they could not explain. Something they could not control. And that was a truth the Ziffern Empire could not afford. Korak turned. He left the chamber without another word. The council did not stop him, because they knew. They all knew. No fleet would be sent. No war would be fought. Not because they had lost, but because the war had never been theirs to begin with. And across the stars, in the ruins of a battlefield that no longer belonged to the living, the warship remained, silent, unmoving, waiting for the next fool who thought they were strong enough to wake it.